The Progressive Era. So this is chapter 21 of your AMSCO book on the Progressive Era, the various things that were happening during that time. Like the antebellum period, we talked about already the antebellum period and the progressive movements of that era. We talked about the populist movement of the previous era. So the end chapters, I guess, 19 would be the populist era. Before that, you have women's suffrage in the 1840s, abolition, obviously, also in the 1830s to the Civil War, and similarly, the progressive era in the 19 teens is a era of social justice. These are movements for an expanded understanding of democracy, more power in the hands of the people, right? The demos in democracy, as opposed to some other entity, and more on that in a second. The shift that happens in this time period. And there's a lot of successes. The movement is by no means radical. This is a very important point. It's not radical. It's it's progressive, right? Like, say, Bernie Sanders is a progressive Democrat, right? He's not a radical politician. He's not. He talks about revolution rhetorically, but he's not talking about people grabbing the burner and going and seizing the means of production or something, right? That's not what Bernie Sanders is advocating for. That would be a radical point of view. I'll talk a little bit about some of the radicals in the time period, but mostly it's the progressives. Okay. Again, progressivism is not new. It is rooted in earlier populist movement, the populist reforms of the 1880s, who called for government regulation. But this has a much longer genealogy. We can go all the way back to, say, Jefferson's distrust of business and capital and his distrust of Washington, Jackson's mistrust of the people or of the government and wanting to put more power in the hands of the people. And this really is the key distinction here, and it's a really important pivot in American history. For Thomas Jefferson, as you saw in in Hamilton, right, the play, the musical, Thomas Jefferson, the enemy is, right, Hamilton, it's big banks, it's too much power in Washington, right? Washington is the enemy. The big government is the enemy. For Andrew Jackson, government is the enemy, right? Strong executive, unless it's him who's holding the office. He wants more power at the local level because the biggest bully on the block is the U.S. government. That's true in the 18th and into the 19th century. By the 20th century, that is no longer true. It is corporations that have the most power. It's corporations that threaten the democratic ideals. It is corporations that threaten having power in the hands of the people. It's the Vanderbilts, the Rockefellers, the Carnegies. These are the people that these reformers in this time period see as the problem. And who do they turn to for help? The federal government. So it's a very important shift in that we can look at the demands that Thomas Jefferson is making, and we can look at the demands that even Eugene Debs, socialist, is making, and we see a lot of consonants. Even though they seem very different, they're both people saying, we want more power in the hands of the people, and there is an enemy out there that's taking that power away. For Jefferson, it is the boogeyman of Washington, D.C. For Eugene Debs, it's corporations and too much power in the hands of too few people, right? Oligarchy is the threat for Eugene Debs, where it is a tyranny for Thomas Jefferson. Really important shift in American history. So what are the goals of these progressives? They want to limit the power of big business. And again, you need the government to do that. You can't just ask them nicely. You have to have the government come in and say, okay, we're going to regulate you. We're going to not allow you to, have 16-hour work days. We're going to pass worker safety laws and food safety laws and all this stuff. They're not going to do it voluntarily. There's no evidence of that. And they understand that. They want to improve and expand democracy. They want to strengthen social justice, and they want to use logic, science, and empiricism. This is important because the populace, the agrarian populace, are tapping into an agricultural understanding of a community and the small guy, as it were, versus the big railroad executive, where the progressives, they're a lot less passionate. It's more about logic. It doesn't make sense to have 10-year-old children working in a factory and getting killed. That doesn't make sense. It's logical. We can do studies and show how these children are better served in educational institutions and schools rather than factories. We did a study. Read the study, right? It's empirical. So it's not like Jefferson, who is dogmatic. He has, kind of an ideological vision. It's not like Jefferson or Jackson, similarly, who's dogmatic and has a certain ideology that he's adhering to, or the progressives. This is a science-based approach, facts and logic, right, as some people say. Who are they? They're largely urban, unlike the populists, right? Populists are rural. Jackson is rural, although he gets some of his support from urban Northern Democratic voters. Jefferson is certainly the godfather of rural ideologies. They are religious, Protestant Christianity. They're very much often against Catholics. This is also one of the reasons why the progressives are like a little bit anti-immigration. It's not all good. They have some biases against immigrants, against Catholics. The middle class, they're not working class and they're not socialists. Lord knows, they don't want to be associated with the socialists. Socialists are radicals. Progressives are not radicals. They don't want to overthrow the government and install a dictatorship of the proletariat or the working class. They just want to reform stuff, right? Okay. This is an era of big political changes, seismic shifts in politics. Teddy Roosevelt starts off as a vice president. McKinley is assassinated. He becomes actually the youngest president, coming in at 43, not youngest elected, but youngest to be president after McKinley is killed. He starts off his career as a Republican. He eventually creates his own party, the Bull Moose Party, which is not long lasting. Robert La Follette from Wisconsin. He's a Wisconsin senator. He starts his career off as a Republican. He becomes a progressive, and then he ultimately becomes a socialist. So again, very interesting sea change happening here. William Jennings Bryan, he's still around. He used to be an agrarian populist Democrat. Now he's a progressive urban Democrat. He keeps running for president. And then Woodrow Wilson, he's a Southern Democrat. So now suddenly Southern Democrats are back in favor, right? Southern Democrats being like the people who were responsible for the Civil War kind of thing. Now suddenly you can have a Democrat in office because Woodrow Wilson is ostensibly a progressive on certain issues. He's also a virulent racist and very much against women's rights. But on other issues, people consider him rather progressive. And indeed, his 14 points after World War I are quite ambitious. Eugene Debs, he starts as a union organizer. We saw him featured in the Great Railroad Strike, the Pullman Strike. He's all around in that time period, Chapter 19 stuff. Now he's a socialist candidate for president running from prison. Gets 6% of the vote, actually, which is quite significant considering he's a socialist and he's in jail. To get 6% of the popular vote is pretty significant, and that's in 1912. Okay, what are the political reforms? They want a secret ballot, Australian ballot, and that becomes a national thing in 1910. It replaces a lot of the corruption in the earlier system. They want direct primaries. So before, this is the way primaries work now. People get to vote for who they want for president or what have you. Before it was party bosses would just, nominate people. They want initiatives, referendum, and recall. This is to have the people have a direct say in government. We have this in California for better and for worse. You can get anything on the ballot if you get enough, well, almost anything, as long as there's not a court challenge. You get enough signatures, you can get it on the ballot. You can also recall governors, senators, whomever. direct election of U.S. senators, and that is what the 17th Amendment is. So let's look at these amendments here quickly. 16th Amendment is an income tax. I've shown that graphic many times about federal revenue. Up until 1913, it is largely excise tax, tariffs, and land sales. Now suddenly there is an income tax. It is a progressive income tax. That is to say, the less money you make, the lower you are taxed at. The more money you make, over certain amounts, you're taxed at a higher percentage, right? So again, it's the example I gave in class. If someone makes $30,000 and someone makes $1 million, the first $30,000 for both of those people is taxed at, say, 10%, right? And that you leave it at that for the person making 30K. For the person making $1 million, after 30,000, they get taxed at 15% from 31,000 from 30,001 to 50, from 50,001 to 80, they get taxed at 20% or whatever. That's the way progressive income tax works, and that's what happens. 17th Amendment is direct election of senators. 18th Amendment, this shows you the other side of the progressive movement, that they're also very religious, and they're also very much against alcohol. Temperance and a prohibition of alcohol has been around forever in American history. And finally, this is the kind of the crowning achievement of the movement, is the prohibition of alcohol in the United States. It's later repealed, but not until the 1930s. 19th Amendment is women's suffrage, the right to vote. That's in 1920. Certain states did allow, way back in the Revolutionary period even, states like New Jersey, for example, women could already vote. And then states also in this time period of the 1920s, Western states are the first ones to allow women to vote. And the reason is, just like in the Jacksonian period, property requirements are taken away nationally under Jackson, but they're initially taken away at the state level, largely in what are then the Western states. Kentucky, Illinois, places where they wanted more people to move so they could have more representation in Congress, and so they could have more people to expropriate native land. So they get rid of the property requirements. That's in the 1830s. In the 19-teens, it is Western states like Nevada, Utah, Wyoming. I think Wyoming actually is the first state to allow women to vote. And that's largely because they want more women and families migrating out there. And also in places like Idaho, it's for the Mormon church, and polygamy is still a thing, but we won't get into that. Beyond politics. Again, as I said, they use logic, morality, science to pass legislation. Pragmatism is a philosophy that emerges in this time period. Most prominent, John Dewey and William James. These are people you'll learn about. Certainly William James you'll learn about in AP Psych if you take it. And their idea is that ideas should be constantly tested and applied to the world. So in terms of philosophical schools of thought, this is different from idealism. Right? So pragmatism is, when we use it all the time, let's be pragmatic, a pragmatic solution that is like a real world common sense thing. It is a philosophy based on that idea, unlike something like idealism, which says there is a certain perfect ideal that you need to strive towards, and it doesn't matter whether it's in ancient Greece or the 1950s, those ideals are the same. That's not pragmatism. Scientific management, this is most famously espoused or championed by Frederick Taylor. He is, what you see in the background, this is Taylorism. It is, as some people in classes call him, the clock guy. One of the things he does is he times people in their jobs to see how they can speed up production. He also says that there's determines the most efficient way to do something, and that then everyone in, say, this room, for example, needs to build whatever they're building in the same way, right? So in a previous generation, you could say, well, I do it this way and you do it that way, and it's fine in the end. We make the same amount of stuff. Taylor says, no, you need to do it in a very specific order of operations, right? Like very clear-cut instructions. This is also the emergence of domestic science. This is women saying, look, if all of this stuff out in the workforce, in industry, can be looked at scientifically, then so should women's labor in the home. And this is where we get the advent of a lot of cookbooks being published, domestic manuals, the use of precise measurements, a cup of this, a teaspoon of that, a tablespoon of the other thing, as opposed to previous eras of cookbook technology, which was, take a pat of butter the size of an egg. Well, what? A quail egg, a duck egg, an ostrich egg? What kind of egg? In this time period of scientific management and domestic science, women say no, a tablespoon of butter, a cup of milk, etc. Wisconsin idea, this is mentioned briefly in your book. It is from the University of Wisconsin system. It eventually goes to Washington, D.C. This is the idea that don't just pass legislation based on what the person giving you money wants you to do. Have universities conduct studies, empirical studies, and then pass legislation based on those studies. Seemed fairly common sense, but it wasn't common sense in the era, and it really revolutionizes politics. It makes it far less corrupt. Sadly, we are very much not in this time period anymore. If a study, empirical, research-based study comes out of a university and a politician doesn't like it, they just go, these, bias, the bias of the, higher education is blah, blah, blah. So sadly, we're kind of in a progressive era now again. But who knows? There's also progressive politicians back in the mainstream. Here's just a political cartoon speaking to the idea that women got the vote first in the West. Right, you have this woman here, right? All these states where women can vote, and all of these, the masses of women back east in the Midwest who want to vote. Writers, so female writers, Nellie Bly, maybe one of the most famous. She writes 10 Days in a Madhouse. She pretends she's insane, is checked into an asylum, and then sees all the bad stuff they do, goes out, gets out, and writes about it. Ida Tarbell, she writes about the Standard Oil Company and their monopolistic practices. Her publication, The History of the Standard Oil Company, is very important in getting people's attention, raising awareness about these corrupt practices, and getting legislation passed to break up the monopoly. Reformers like Jane Addams, known as the mother of social work, she founds Hull House, which is a reform institution for new immigrant mothers in Chicago, where they learn domestic science and various other things to help them acclimate and assimilate to American culture. Elaine Swallows Richards is a home economics person. Margaret Sanger, birth control. She's the founder of what is now Planned Parenthood, providing birth control and family management practices to women. Before this time period, childbirth is the number one cause of death for women. So obviously birth control is a very big deal in order to empower and make women more independent and have them live longer. It's important for a woman to be able to have control over whether she is going to have a second kid or a 12th kid, which in the 1800s was not uncommon for women to just have children really from their mid-teens on, many of them dying along the way in childbirth. So obviously these people are Margaret Sanger is very important in this regard. And then Ida B. Wells, African-American activist, who is, she is the lone African-American woman in this list. Again, as I said, the progressive movement is very white, very middle class. Ida B. Wells is unlike the other women in that she's obviously African-American. She is more radical, and she is very central to the movements against lynching in the South, which is, again, was quite common practice in the 19-teens and 1920s. Lynching of African-Americans, men and women. Muckrakers, this is a kind of quote-unquote investigative journalism. It's a little sensationalized, but it's also based in, right, they're not making stuff up, so it's not fake news, right? It's maybe like a little bit sensationalized news, but it does raise awareness about all the stuff that's happening. Frank Norris's Octopus, The Jungle by Upton Sinclair, The irony of the jungle being is that Sinclair is a socialist. He publishes The Jungle to expose the bad working conditions of immigrants in Chicago's meatpacking industry. And the scenes depicting the unsanitary conditions of the food are so gross that the novel is a huge smash hit, and a bunch of legislation is passed about food safety. Meanwhile, Sinclair is saying, well, wait a minute, that's not what the novel was about. The novel was about workers' rights. What about workers' rights? But the depictions of the unsanitary food was so appalling that he got something else out of it. How the Other Half Lives, a photo essay on immigrant houses, very central in passing housing reform in cities like New York, making the housing more sanitary, more safe. And then the formula is easy. Find a scandal, attack it with facts, and it is very, very influential. And it's better than the earlier yellow journalism. Yellow journalism was largely just make stuff made up, where this is more based in truth. Very influential in this time period. And okay, lastly, contradictions in progressivism. Not great on race. Not great on recent immigrants. If anything, the progressive movement, I mean, Woodrow Wilson, for crying out loud, is considered a progressive, and he's an infamous racist. Shows the racist silent film Birth of a Nation in the White House, and is very excited to do so, and says that it's very important that Americans understand why the Ku Klux Klan is so important for keeping African American Southerners in line. So yeah, that's Woodrow Wilson. He's a progressive. Also, they're largely not great on immigration. They don't like immigrants. They're xenophobic. They don't like Catholics. And while they want to help immigrants, it's a very condescending form of outreach. Many oppose women's suffrage, so Woodrow Wilson is one of these. He makes it about a states' rights thing. This is something we'll increasingly see, is Woodrow Wilson does not want women to vote. He makes it fairly clear that that's his belief, but he couches that belief in a federalist argument, saying that women's right to vote should not be a national issue, but rather should be based on a state-to-state thing. This is what you often see when someone is opposed to something and wants to punt on it. Civil rights, similar pushback. It shouldn't be a national issue. It should be a state's issue. Roe versus Wade, similarly with abortion rights. It's not that I don't want people to have abortion rights. It's just that it should be at the state level. So we see this a lot in terms of a kind of sleight of hand in which it is actually about one thing, but the argument becomes a kind of legalese federalist argument. And that's what Woodrow Wilson does in his opposition to women's right to vote. Many progressives don't like labor unions. They think that they're radical. They don't want unions having more power. Unions are working class organizations, and the progressives are not working class. They're middle class, right? They're middle class. They don't want poor working class people having more power. They want to help them. They want to, be beneficent. They want to have outreach. They want to lift them up, but they are the ones that want to be responsible for that uplift. They don't want the working class getting too much power, so they oppose unions. They also oppose unions because they're afraid of Marxism. A lot of union leadership are Marxists. Some are socialists. Some are foreign, and they already don't like foreigners. So all of that leads to a fear of a kind of radical uprising. And obviously, if there's an uprising of the working and lower classes, the middle class is not simpatico with the working class, right? The middle class is on the side of the ruling class, say the unions, right? So they don't want that to happen. And they're against immigration. This is a time period, as we'll see, I think in the next lecture, where we get immigration restrictions really begin to peak. 1924 being the most restrictive immigration laws. And that is largely also part of the progressive platform, that they want to limit immigration from Southern Europe and Eastern Europe. These are largely immigrants that are not considered white: Italians, Greeks, Polish, Jewish Eastern Europeans from across Eastern Europe and Russia, all are targeted for Asian, obviously, it's been going on since the 1880s, are targets of immigration restrictions. So that is the AMSCO Chapter 21 on the Progressive Era.